The mask of silence. The child learned early that silence was safer than sound. Words, when spoken, had teeth. They summoned fists. They sharpened the rage in her father's eyes, and they drew blood her mother could never hide well enough. Silence, by contrast, was a shield. It turned her into a shadow in her own home, present, yet untouchable, at least for a moment. Her earliest memories were not of toys or lullabies, but of doorframes rattling beneath slamming fists, of the muffled sobs her mother pressed into pillows, of footsteps pacing outside her bedroom like a predator circling prey. Childhood was not measured in seasons or birthdays, it was measured in nights survived. The mask came later, not of porcelain or fabric, but of expression. She learned to arrange her face into neutrality so complete that it could not be deciphered. When teachers asked questions, she answered softly, politely, but without inflection. When children teased her for her quiet, she smiled faintly, never enough to betray emotion. It was a mask polished by necessity, a second skin that hid the turmoil she dared not expose. The breaking point came one winter night, when the storm outside was no louder than the storm within. Her mother's cries rose higher than usual, desperate, uncontained. She crept from her bed, small feet padding across cold floorboards, and opened the door just enough to see the scene that would brand itself forever into her mind. Her father's hands around her mother's throat, his face contorted with drunken fury, her mother's eyes wide with the realization that this time there would be no reprieve. She did not scream. Even at that age, she understood that sound was futile. Instead, she backed away, pulled the blanket over her head, and waited in silence as the house grew still again, still in a way that no house should ever be. Her mother was gone by morning, the whispers that followed, neighbors shaking their heads, social workers murmuring about tragedy, about placement, blurred into background noise. What she remembered most was her father's eyes when he realized she had witnessed everything. There was no apology in them, no shame, only a warning: you are mine to shape or to break. He did not get the chance. Within weeks, the state took her from his grasp. She was delivered to the orphanage, a place that smelled of mildew and disinfectant, where the walls hummed with other children's grief. Yet even there, she remained an outlier. While others cried for parents who might one day return, she did not. Her grief was not for what was lost, but for what had always been poisoned. At the orphanage, her mask hardened. The caretakers praised her obedience, her composure. She never lashed out, never spoke out of turn. In truth, she was studying. She watched the other children, their tantrums, their begging, their fragile attempts to bargain with fate, and she learned the futility of noise. Control was not in outbursts, it was in restraint. Sometimes in the dead of night, she would sneak into the bathroom and stare at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She practiced faces, a smile here, a pout there, eyes widened in feigned surprise. She learned to mimic what was expected, to craft emotion like an actress rehearsing for a role she would one day perform flawlessly. Behind the performance, however, her eyes remained steady, empty, years blurred. Potential adopters came and went, walking the halls with plastic smiles and questions that sounded more like assessments. They liked her at first, her politeness, her neatness, her calm, but something in her unsettled them. Perhaps it was the way she held eye contact too long, or the faint delay before her laughter, as though she were calculating the exact second when it should erupt. Families chose others she did not mind. Families, she understood, were cages disguised as comforts. Adolescence sharpened her mind, though it brought no sanctuary. While other girls whispered about crushes and dances, she sat in corners with books she half believed in: philosophy, psychology, journals of human behavior. She read not for escape, but for dissection. Words were scalpels. She used them to peel back the skin of humanity, to glimpse the sinews of motive and weakness beneath. By the time she aged out of the system, she was neither hopeful nor afraid. She carried with her only what she had always carried: silence, a mask, and the memory of her mother's fading eyes. Freedom, if one could call it that, was unkind. She worked menial jobs first, cleaning offices after hours, stacking shelves in supermarkets. The world noticed her little, and she cultivated that invisibility with care. It was easier to observe when no one was observing you. But the city, restless, greedy, indifferent, also gave her new lessons. She saw men in pressed suits sneering at waitresses, pawing at secretaries, laughing too loudly at their own crude jokes. She saw how power clothed itself in confidence, how cruelty disguised itself as charm. And something inside her began to stir, faint but insistent. The mask, which had always been armor, became an instrument. She could tilt her head just so, widen her eyes at the right moment, laugh in a way that made men lean closer. What they saw was not her, but a reflection of their own desire. What they could not see was the calculation beneath. At night, when the city exhaled its neon breath, she walked alone, rehearsing conversations in the dark, speaking to no one yet perfecting every cadence. The mask was no longer just for survival, it was becoming a weapon, and yet, beneath the growing sharpness of her performance, the old wound remained. Every flickering street lamp, every siren in the distance, every echo of a slammed door tugged her back to that winter night when silence had failed to save her mother. Rage lived there, coiled tight, waiting for release. Her transformation had not yet begun, but the foundation had been laid. She was a woman carved from tragedy, sculpted by discipline, sharpened by observation. The world thought her quiet, compliant, unremarkable. But she knew better. Masks are not only for hiding, they are also for hunting. The first cut adulthood did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in quietly, like a draft slipping beneath the orphanage door. At 18, she stepped out with no family to claim her, no legacy to inherit, only a duffel bag of state, issued clothes, and the sharpened instinct of a girl who had survived by silence. The city swallowed her whole. It was louder than she imagined, filled with clattering trains, endless voices, and men in coats who never noticed her unless they wanted something. She rented a room in a building that smelled of damp plaster and boiled cabbage. The walls were thin, and at night she heard arguments, beds creaking, radios murmuring half, songs through static. She did not decorate, did not soften the space. A bed, a desk, a lamp, that was enough. She had learned long ago not to attach herself to objects. By day, she worked at a typing pool, her fingers moving quickly, neatly across the keys. She wore muted skirts, crisp blouses, hair pinned tight. Her colleagues whispered about men they longed for, nights at dance halls, dreams of marriage. She listened but rarely contributed. They thought her shy. In truth, she was cataloging them, storing away every hesitation, every blush, every lie told to impress. People revealed themselves constantly. They simply never noticed the witness who said little. Men noticed her differently, at first only in passing. The polite nod of a supervisor, the appreciative glance of clients as they walked by. But gradually, as she refined the mask, she saw their attention sharpen. She would tilt her chin a fraction higher, soften her mouth with a calculated half-smile, and watch them lean forward, believing they had glimpsed something real. It was not desire she offered them, but reflection. She made them see what they wanted most. Her first test came in the form of a manager from another floor, a man with thinning hair slicked back, and a habit of letting his hand linger too long on the arms of secretaries. He mistook her quietness for pliancy, her composure for weakness. One evening, when most of the staff had gone, he lingered near her desk with a grin that never reached his eyes. "You work too hard," he said, placing his hand over hers as if he owned it. She did not flinch. Instead, she tilted her head, studied him, and smiled faintly, just enough to invite his assumption. Inside, her mind was calculating. The weight of his hand, the sweat on his palm, the arrogance in his voice. For the first time, she felt something bloom within her, not fear, not disgust, but curiosity. How far would he go if she let him believe he led? Over the next week, she cultivated his interest, a pause in conversation here, a lowered gaze there. She allowed him to think his advances worked, that she was bending. Each evening he pressed closer, his words bolder. She played along, rehearsing each interaction afterward in the mirror, noting where her smile should linger, where her voice should tremble. It became a performance, and she was flawless. The night came naturally. He suggested they share a drink after work. She agreed, though her glass remained mostly untouched as his emptied. He bragged about deals, about women, about power. She listened, nodding, filing away every syllable. When he leaned closer, breath thick with whiskey, she whispered that she knew a quieter place. He followed eagerly. The basement belonged to the building she cleaned part. Time for extra money, a favor from a janitor who barely remembered her face. Few people went there. The flickering lights made it unwelcoming, the smell of bleach and damp heavy in the air. She led him down concrete steps, heels clicking, his laughter echoing too loud against the walls. When the door shut, her mask dropped. It was subtle at first. Her smile faded, her eyes hardened. He chuckled nervously, asking what game this was. She stepped closer, the knife already in her hand, a tool she had taken from the cleaning supplies, sharpened in secret nights. His grin faltered. He stammered excuses, hands raised as though that could undo the inevitability pressing in on him. She said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The blade entered with deliberate precision, not wild or clumsy but exact, as if she had rehearsed it countless times in silence. His cry echoed once, then dissolved into the hum of fluorescent lights. She watched his body twitch, then collapse, the arrogance drained from his face. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring down at him. She had expected horror, perhaps trembling hands, nausea. Instead, she felt calm, unnervingly so. Her heart beat steady, her breathing even. What she felt most was clarity, control. She knelt beside him, tilting her head. She whispered his own words back to him, the crude jokes, the empty boasts. They sounded absurd now, spilling into the silence of the basement. She cut deliberately, not in frenzy but in ceremony. Each motion felt like writing upon flesh, as though she were carving her own survival into permanence. When she tasted blood for the first time, it was not hunger she felt, but revelation. The flavor was metallic, bitter, and yet it anchored her in a way nothing else had. This was not indulgence. This was transformation. Afterward, she cleaned with meticulous care. Bleach erased what it could. The body disappeared through methods she had studied quietly for months, details pieced together from obscure texts, whispered stories, and sheer intuition. When she ascended the steps again, she was once more the polite secretary, shoes clicking, blouse neatly tucked. No one suspected. The manager had been known for sudden trips, for vanishing into nights of drink. His absence was attributed to his own vices. Rumors filled the gaps, and she smiled faintly when asked if she had seen him. It was then she realized the brilliance of her mask. It was not only a shield, not only a performance. It was an alibi. In the days that followed, she carried herself differently. Colleagues noticed only that she seemed calmer, more poised. Inside, however, something had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer the orphan defined by silence, nor the girl shaped by tragedy. She was an architect of her own fate. By day, she typed memos, fetched coffee, answered phones with perfect composure. By night, she rehearsed, planned, sharpened. She had tasted what it meant to control not just herself, but another life entirely, to decide when a heart would stop, when arrogance would be punished. The hunger was not constant. It pulsed like a second heartbeat, quiet yet insistent, waiting for the next performance. She did not fear it. She welcomed it. The shadow in the corridor. By the third year of her employment, she had become indispensable. Colleagues admired her punctuality, clients remarked on her poise, and her superiors praised her charm as though it were a rare commodity they owned. She never corrected them, let them think she was their asset, their prize secretary who anchored contracts with a smile and typed words into permanence. What they never understood was that every glance, every compliment, every assumption was another layer of the mask she had perfected. The office smelled of ink, carbon paper, and stale coffee. Desks stretched in endless rows, each occupied by clerks who whispered about raises, promotions, and rumored affairs. She sat among them like a polished statue, contributing little, listening to everything. Gossip was an education. In their voices, she learned how quickly admiration soured into envy, how rumors spread faster than truth, how suspicion could smolder beneath civility. She was careful, always careful. Victims were chosen with precision, men who traveled often, men who lived alone, men whose absence could be excused by vice or wanderlust. Her charm made introductions effortless. A smile in a bar, a lowered gaze on a train, a coincidence manufactured into fate. They followed her willingly, believing themselves the hunters. They never realized they had already been chosen. Each encounter deepened her ritual. Tools were arranged with meticulous order, the knife sharpened, the cloth laid out, the bleach ready in its bottle. The basement became a sanctuary, humming with fluorescent light, the air heavy with the sterility of her preparation. She moved with the calm of a surgeon, each incision deliberate, each gesture stripped of waste. There was no frenzy, no clumsiness, only ceremony. The taste of blood no longer startled her, it steadied her. In it she felt continuity, as though each act connected her to the moment of her first defiance. The night she had discovered she was not merely surviving but creating. It was not hunger she fed, but identity, and yet the city began to whisper. Newspapers reported disappearances in cautious columns, local businessman fails to return, traveling agent last seen leaving hotel. Most readers skimmed such notices without pause, but patterns existed for those who looked closely. The gaps between reports shortened. The victims, though scattered across districts, shared uncanny similarities. Whispers reached the office too. Clients muttered about colleagues who had gone missing. Clerks traded theories in low voices by the water cooler. Some claimed the men had fled debts. Others suggested women or alcohol. A few joked nervously about a predator stalking the city. She laughed with them when expected, the perfect imitation of concern. Inside, she listened carefully, gauging how close their imagination might stumble to truth. It was during one such conversation that she first noticed him. Detective Daniel Mercer was not tall, nor particularly imposing, but he carried himself with a stillness that drew attention. Where others fidgeted, he stood calm, his gaze heavy, deliberate. He arrived under the pretense of clarifying timelines, asking about clients last seen in the company of her firm. His questions were polite, his tone almost apologetic, yet his eyes lingered longer than courtesy allowed. When it was her turn to answer, she tilted her head, allowed a faint smile, and replied with flawless composure. She spoke of meetings, appointments, the small details of scheduling that were impossible to dispute. He nodded, made notes, thanked her. To anyone else the exchange seemed routine, but she felt his gaze linger after he turned away. He had noticed something, not enough to name, but enough to remember. That night, in the basement, she replayed the encounter. His voice, his posture, the sharpness in his questions. Mercer was different from the others, not arrogant, not careless. He was watchful. He carried silence like a weapon. She responded by refining her mask further. Her laughter at work became more natural, her small talk more convincing. She joined colleagues for lunches she once avoided, allowed them to glimpse her as friendly, even vulnerable. If suspicion ever pointed her way, she would be insulated by their memories of her kindness. She rehearsed answers aloud in her room, sharpening every syllable into plausibility. Still, cracks appeared. A colleague remarked once that she was almost too perfect. Another whispered that she seemed detached, as though her mind lived elsewhere. She smiled in reply, dismissed it as nerves, but inside the words lingered. Perfection itself could invite suspicion. She adjusted again, weaving in tiny flaws, a misfiled document, a stammer during a meeting, a forgotten detail. She learned to make herself human, but Mercer's shadow lengthened. He returned more often, each time with questions that edged closer. He asked about dates, about clients' habits, about who had last seen them alive. His pen moved swiftly, yet his eyes never lost hers. She met his gaze unflinching, tilting her head, even laughing at his more absurd queries. But afterward, alone, she felt the faintest tremor in her chest, not fear, but recognition. Here, at last, was someone who might see her not as mask, not as asset, but as truth. Her rituals grew more precise in response. Each disappearance was timed carefully, spaced deliberately. She cleaned with obsessive rigor, bleaching until the air itself stung her lungs. Every cut, every act of consumption became sharper, more ceremonial, as though defying the hunter who circled unseen. And yet, beneath her composure, memory stirred. Late at night, after the bleach faded and silence reclaimed the basement, she thought of her father. His voice, his fists, the way his shadow once filled every doorway. She had believed him gone, erased by death or distance. But in dreams he returned not strong, but frail, whispering her name, asking forgiveness she would never give. She woke with clenched fists, sweat dampening her sheets. For the first time since her first kill, she felt unsettled. The past was not buried, it waited, patient, biding its time. When she walked into the office the next morning, her colleagues greeted her warmly, laughter spilling across the desks. She smiled, offered coffee, typed letters with precision. But in her reflection in the darkened glass of the window, she saw her own face differently. The mask, yes, but beneath it, something restless, something waiting. And as she caught Mercer watching her from the corridor, his notebook in hand, she realized the stage was shifting. The audience was no longer blind. The return of the ghost, the air had grown brittle with autumn when he appeared again, as though carried in by the season itself, a ghost clothed in flesh, gaunt and diminished, but still unmistakable. She saw him first from across the street, an old man standing near the office gates, hat in hand, shoulders stooped as though bent by a weight greater than age. The face was hollowed, the jaw slackened, the voice, when it finally reached her, barely more than a rasp. But there was no mistaking the eyes, pale, sunken, yet carrying that same quiet violence she remembered from childhood nights. Her breath caught, though her face betrayed nothing. She had trained herself too well. She crossed to him, her heels clicking against the pavement, the mask of civility fixed firmly in place. "Father," she said softly, almost as though greeting a stranger. He flinched at the word, a tremor passing across his mouth before he forced a smile. His teeth were yellowed, a few missing, his skin lined with veins that pulsed weakly beneath parchment flesh. "My girl," he whispered, "you've grown, more than I could have imagined." The street moved around them, indifferent. Clerks hurried past, a tram rattled by, the world unaware that a nightmare had stepped back into her daylight. She wanted to recoil, to spit in his face, to drag him by the collar into the dark where justice was hers alone to meet. But she only inclined her head, controlled, measured. "What do you want?" she asked. He swallowed, his throat working like dry leather. "Forgiveness." The word came out broken, pleading. "I've been sick. Time humbles a man. I thought perhaps we might speak, perhaps mend what was broken." Her hands tightened around the strap of her bag. Behind her composure, memory uncoiled. The slam of his boots on the orphanage floor, the sting of the belt, the suffocating nights when his rage filled the walls. She remembered the mask the nuns had strapped upon her face to silence screams, and now here he stood, frail as paper, daring to ask absolution. She forced a smile. "Another time, perhaps. I'm very busy." He nodded, defeated, yet a spark of hope flickered in his eyes, hope she despised. He shuffled away, shoulders quaking, as though each step might crumble him to dust. That night, the basement cold with a fury she had never felt. The ritual sharpened into something almost ecstatic, her hands steady as blades traced skin, as bleach burned the air raw. Yet it was not her latest victim she saw before her, but her father trembling, begging, reduced. She dissected the memory, cut it apart piece by piece, but still it returned. The past was not silenced. It had come back, knocking on her door. At the office, she wore her brightest mask. She laughed at jokes, poured coffee for her colleagues, and typed correspondence with flawless rhythm. Yet her hands trembled once, barely noticeable, when the phone rang unexpectedly. A co-worker glanced at her curiously, but she recovered instantly, murmuring some excuse about a late night. It was Mercer who noticed. He had taken to appearing without warning, his notebook ever at hand, his questions deceptively casual. But his eyes, they were scalpel, sharp, peeling away layers of pretense. He asked about schedules, about alibis, about who she saw outside of work. His voice remained polite, but his persistence carried a weight that unsettled even her practiced calm. One afternoon, he stopped her in the corridor, his frame casting a shadow that seemed to stretch longer than his body should allow. "You looked startled earlier," he said, when the phone rang. She tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Did I? I suppose I was lost in thought. Too much work." He didn't reply immediately. His silence was worse than accusation. Finally, he closed his notebook, gave her a faint smile, and walked away. She watched him go, a faint pulse racing in her throat. Mercer, she realized, was circling closer than ever. Her father returned again a week later. This time he came to her lodging, knocking timidly at the door like a beggar. She opened it only a fraction, enough to see the hollows of his cheeks, the wet glisten of his eyes. "I don't have long," he said. "The doctors tell me my lungs are failing. I don't want to leave this world carrying the weight of what I did to you. Please, just speak with me." She studied him, silent. For a moment she considered dragging him inside, showing him the basement, laying out her instruments as she had for others, to let him feel at last the precision of her justice. But she closed the door instead, softly, deliberately, leaving him coughing in the hallway. That night her dreams writhed. She saw him seated in her basement, frail and whimpering as she prepared her tools. She woke with nails digging into her palms, blood beating where skin had broken. Something had shifted. Her ritual was no longer enough to quiet the storm. In the office, the whispers grew louder. Her colleagues spoke in hushed voices of the detective's frequent visits, of the strange coincidence that so many of their clients had disappeared. She played her part, concerned, curious, even frightened, while ensuring suspicion never lingered too long upon her. But Mercer's gaze followed her more keenly now. He asked fewer questions aloud, yet his presence itself became interrogation. When their eyes met across the room, she felt exposed, as though he already knew, and was only waiting for her to falter. And then, one evening, as she descended into her basement sanctuary, she found herself pausing at the doorway. She imagined her father seated in the chair where her victims once sat, his frail chest rising and falling, his voice cracking as he begged. She could almost hear it, a phantom sound that chilled her blood. She realized then that the time of avoidance was ending. His return had disrupted the balance she had crafted so carefully between predator and mask, between daylight and shadow. The past had come to claim its reckoning. Letters in the dust. The first letter arrived folded into a plain envelope, its corners smudged, the script wavering with the hand that had written it. She found it slipped beneath her door one morning, as though a trespasser had entered unseen. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and mildew, its lines filled with apologies so rehearsed they read like scripture. "My daughter," it began, "time has stripped me of strength, of pride, of all that once made me a man. I ask nothing but a chance to see you, to speak with you before the end comes. My lungs betray me. My nights are filled with visions of what I did to you. Forgive me if you can. If not, at least let me carry your face with me when I leave this world." She burned the letter in the sink without hesitation, watching the flames devour the pleading words. Yet even in ashes, they lingered curling shapes against porcelain, black dust clinging stubbornly as though unwilling to disappear. More letters followed, each written in the same uneven hand, each carried the stench of weakness. He left them beneath her door or pressed them into the hands of neighbors who passed them along with sympathetic eyes. She never replied. Silence was her answer, but she read every one, devouring them with a hatred so precise it sharpened her ritual blade. The basement bore witness to her transformation. Where once her movements were controlled, almost surgical, now they bordered on frenzy. Her knife traced flesh more forcefully, her breath heavier, her arms trembling with fury that had no outlet. The bleach burned her throat, the light above flickered as though mocking her control. She told herself each incision was upon him, upon the man who had marked her childhood with terror, who now dared cloak himself in repentance. One night, as she cleaned the floor, she saw her reflection warped in the bleach, stained concrete. For an instant, it was not her face at all, but his hollow eyes, yellow teeth, lips mouthing pleas she could not hear. She struck the image with the mop until the water splashed red. Still, when morning came, she dressed flawlessly. She pinned her hair neatly, applied the faintest rouge, and stepped into the office with her practiced smile. To her colleagues she was the same secretary, precise and cordial, but beneath their chatter whispers thickened. "They say the detective's been here again," one clerk muttered, glancing toward her desk. always asking for her. Another replied, lowering his voice, "Strange, don't you think? Strange." The first echoed, though neither dared speak louder. She pretended not to notice, but their voices coiled around her spine. Mercer no longer played at courtesy. His visits became frequent, his questions sharper. He laid out times, dates, places, and names, like beads upon a string. He asked not only of clients but of her own movements. "You were at the Carlton Hotel 2 weeks ago, were you not?" he asked one morning, notebook open. She met his gaze, calm as marble. "I delivered papers there for Mr. Halden. You may confirm it with him." Mercer's pen scratched, yet his eyes lingered, and afterward, "Did you remain long?" She allowed a faint laugh. "Detective, you make it sound as though I have an exciting life outside of ledgers and memos. No, I returned straight here." Again the silence. He closed his notebook with deliberate care, nodded, and stepped away. But she felt the sting of his doubt like a blade at her throat. The second fracture came from her father himself. She glimpsed him one evening as she returned from work, seated on a bench across the street, coughing into a handkerchief mottled with blood. His frame seemed smaller than ever, his coat too large, his body trembling with each spasm. For a moment she halted, watching him unseen. In his collapse she should have found satisfaction, the predator undone, reduced to prey by his own failing lungs. Yet rage consumed her instead. It was not enough that he should decay naturally. Not enough that time would claim him gently. She wanted his ending to be hers to administer, in the place of her choosing, by the instruments she had sanctified. She entered her lodging without a word, but her hands shook as she bolted the door. That night, the basement was not sanctuary but crucible. She paced, tools gleaming beneath the harsh bulb, as though awaiting a victim she had not yet brought down. In her mind, she rehearsed the ritual again and again, his body strapped to the chair, his breath wheezing as she prepared the knife, his voice breaking in pleas she would not hear. But he remained outside her grasp, a ghost too fragile to seize, and the frustration tore at her until her vision swam. Meanwhile, Mercer pressed harder. One afternoon, he entered her office unannounced, standing by her desk as clerks pretended to work noisily around them. "You seem burdened," he said quietly, his gaze heavy. "Your eyes betray fatigue." She looked up, startled by his directness. For a flicker of a second, the mask slipped just a tremor at the corner of her mouth. But it was enough. His eyes narrowed, and she felt, with sickening clarity, that he had seen through. "I sleep little," she replied, voice even. "The work here demands much, that is all." He inclined his head, but she knew he was not satisfied. The balance, once so carefully preserved, now tilted precariously. At the office, her colleagues watched her with sidelong glances. At home, the letters multiplied, each filled with trembling apologies she burned but could not forget. In the basement, her rituals lost the serenity of art and became storms of violence. And above all, Mercer loomed not as shadow, but as hunter, circling ever closer. One night, as she scrubbed the floor raw, she realized the truth with a clarity that froze her blood. She could not maintain this divide much longer. Either her father's ghost would be exorcised in flesh, or Mercer would tear away the mask entirely. The question was not if the end would come, it was when. The net Titan's detective Mercer altered his methods. Gone were the casual visits cloaked in civility. He no longer asked idle questions at her desk or lingered politely at the office door. His presence now carried weight, sharpened by authority. 2 constables accompanied him one morning, their uniforms black against the marble floor of the lobby. He did not seek her permission, but announced his purpose: routine inquiries. The department requires clarification on several accounts. He spoke loudly enough that every clerk within earshot looked up, pens stilled, whispers darting like moths through the air. She rose with perfect calm, adjusting her cuffs before leading them into the boardroom. The blinds were drawn, dust motes swirling in the narrow light. Mercer laid out papers, travel records, hotel ledgers, statements from porters and attendants. His fingers traced circles on the pages as he spoke. "You are often present," he said evenly, "not by accusation, you understand, but by proximity. A woman resembling you, always near the periphery of misfortune." She tilted her head, offering a faint smile. Proximity, detective, is not guilt. Shall we also accuse the street lamps that burn above each incident? The constable shifted uneasily, but Mercer did not relent. Street lamps do not leave impressions upon men who vanish. You do. For an instant, silence pressed the room. She forced herself not to flinch. Her heartbeat thundered, but her smile held, thin and cold as glass. That evening, as she returned home, she found him waiting her father, seated upon the steps of her building like a forgotten beggar. His coat sagged from his shoulders, his chest heaved with each rattling breath. "Child," he rasped, lifting a trembling hand, "I must speak. I must be heard before—" She halted, the keys clenched in her fist. The sight of him withered, hollow, coughing blood into a kerchief did not inspire pity. Instead, fury surged. This was not the Titan who had struck terror into her childhood nights. This was a husk, clinging to life with filthy fingers. That he dared claim her attention now, when his strength had abandoned him, filled her with disgust. "Go," she whispered, "leave before I summon the constable." But he remained, his eyes watery with age, shone with desperation. "Please, I have no one. I will not live the year. Grant me." She turned from him, ascended the steps, and closed the door without another word. Yet the echo of his cough seeped beneath the threshold, following her into the dark. The office grew unbearable. Colleagues spoke in lowered voices, but no longer hid their suspicion. She felt their eyes upon her when she bent over ledgers, heard the abrupt silence when she entered the break room. "She's too composed," one muttered. "No one remains that calm under scrutiny unless—" The rest unfinished, but clear. Her employer worsened the strain. He summoned her with demands cloaked as compliments. "Our clients trust you, miss. You must accompany Mr. Stanton this evening dinner at the Carlton. Keep him charmed. The firm depends upon you." His eyes glittered with greed, unbothered by the whispers around her. She obeyed outwardly, but inside contempt burned. Each command from him fed the vision of his body upon the basement floor, his authority silenced, his voice extinguished. The basement no longer granted solace. Its shadows whispered, its tools gleamed too brightly. She descended nightly with the resolve to rehearse control, yet her hands shook as she arranged the instruments. She heard her father's voice in the scrape of the chair, Mercer's in the hum of the light. Her rituals became fractured incisions less measured, her breath unsteady, her tears falling unbidden. She muttered words not for herself, but to specters only she perceived. "You will kneel, you will beg. You will end here." Once, pausing to wipe her blade, she glanced at the wall and saw it wet not with bleach, but with blood, dark and fresh, dripping in rivulets. She blinked, and it was gone, only pale concrete staring back. She pressed her palm to the stone, uncertain where dream ended and waking began. Mercer's shadow lengthened. He waited near her lodgings, watched her from across cafes, appeared on her street without explanation. She knew his presence was deliberate, a tightening snare. He wanted her unsettled, her mask fractured. One evening he confronted her directly. She had just stepped from a carriage when his voice cut the night. "How many more, miss?" She froze. "Pardon? How many more men will vanish before you tire of the game?" His voice was low, steady, but his eyes burned with certainty. She forced a laugh, brittle as glass. "You mistake me for your phantom, detective." His hand lingered at his coat pocket, where she imagined a warrant already written. "Perhaps, but truth persists even when hidden. You know it, I know it, and one day you will falter." She turned sharply, entering the building, but his words clung like iron shackles. That night she sat alone in the basement, the knife gleaming on the table. Her father's face rose in her mind, weak, coughing, yet unrepentant. Mercer's voice echoed, promising her inevitable fall. The walls pressed inward, the air thickened. She felt the two men converging upon her existence, one with pleas of forgiveness, the other with demands of justice. She understood with a clarity that burned. She could not endure both. One must be silenced by her hand before the other stripped her bare. And so she resolved. Her father would descend these steps. He would kneel upon this floor. He would beg in the place of her choosing, not upon a street, not in daylight, but here beneath the buzzing light, with her knife poised above him. only then would the cycle end. The Last Supper, he came to her door on a night when the rain slicked the streets and the lamps guttered against the wind. His knock was timid, not the thunder of a man who once ruled his household with fists. She opened the door in silence, her face unreadable. He stood hunched, coughing into his sleeve, his body broken by years and illness. "Daughter," he whispered, voice ragged, "I have nowhere else to go." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. He mistook the gesture for mercy. He entered with gratitude trembling in his eyes, never noticing the absence of warmth in hers. She led him wordlessly down the narrow stairs, her steps slow, deliberate. He followed, his hand trailing the wall for support, his breath rattling. "What is this place?" he murmured when the door closed behind them, when the light above buzzed into its cold white glow. The basement stretched before him, bare concrete walls, the table laid with instruments gleaming in neat order, blades of varying length, calipers, bone saw, forceps polished to silver. A cloth already stained from prior use hung at the edge. The air reeked faintly of bleach, sharp and sterile. He faltered, realizing too late that this was no refuge. "Sit," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. She gestured toward the chair bolted to the floor. He obeyed, still believing her kindness real, still hoping for reconciliation. "I am sorry," he whispered. "For all of it, I was not a father, not a man. I see that now." His chest heaved with effort. "Let me die with your forgiveness." Her gaze fixed upon him, unblinking. "Forgiveness," she repeated, the word hollow. "You ask me to undo what you did with words alone." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "I carry her bruises still," she said softly, though her tone carried iron. "My mother's cries, the nights we hid, the mornings she painted her face to conceal what you had written there. Do you remember? Do you recall the chains you forged?" His lips trembled. "I was wrong. I was lost. Drink, anger, my own demons." She cut him off with a sharp movement of her hand. "Excuses, always excuses." The ritual began without ceremony. She strapped his wrists to the chair, leather binding brittle against his thin skin. He did not resist, too weak, too broken, or perhaps too convinced that her anger would soften, but her face was a mask carved from stone. The knife gleamed under the fluorescent light as she lifted it, her hand steady. For a moment he met her gaze, his eyes wide, shimmering with the terror he had once instilled in her. "I gave you fear," he whispered hoarsely. "Now you return it." "No," she replied, her voice level. "I give you truth." The blade kissed his flesh, slow, deliberate, tracing lines that mirrored the scars etched upon her memory. His cries filled the room, weak at first, then breaking into hoarse wails. Each sound was a hymn to her justice, each drop of blood a verse erased from her childhood. As the work progressed, her thoughts fractured, drifting between present and past. She saw herself as a child again, cowering beneath a bed as footsteps thundered down the hall. She heard her mother's sobs, muffled behind locked doors. She tasted copper in her mouth, the same taste that now coated her tongue as she worked. At last, when his strength ebbed and his pleas slurred into incoherence, she leaned close, whispering, "This is not vengeance. This is release." And with deliberate precision, she struck the final blow. His body slumped, the breath escaping in a last rattling sigh. Silence settled heavy, broken only by the hum of the light. She knelt before him, her hands steady, her face calm. The ritual was not rushed. Each motion carried weight as though guided by unseen hands. She cut deliberately, almost reverently, until she held the morsel she had chosen. When she brought it to her lips, the taste was unlike any before. It was not indulgence, not hunger. It was consummation, the final severing of chains that had bound her for decades. She felt the echo of her mother's cries fade, felt the bruises dissolve into air. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not of sorrow, they were of liberation. For the first time she stood free. She cleaned with meticulous care, wiping every surface, bleaching every stain, disposing of remnants with the efficiency of years' practice. When she emerged, her face glowed with serenity, her steps lighter than ever before. To the world above, she was the same secretary, polished and precise, but within she had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer the child of an abuser, nor the orphan scarred by grief. She was the woman who had mastered her past, transformed it into dominion. Yet as she left the building the next morning, she saw Mercer's figure across the street. He stood beneath a lamppost, his coat collar raised, his gaze fixed upon her. Though he spoke no word, she felt the weight of his certainty. The hound at the door, morning sunlight streamed across her desk as though nothing had changed. Papers neatly stacked, pens aligned, her blouse pressed crisp and immaculate. To her colleagues, she was the same diligent secretary, graceful, tireless, perfectly composed. They greeted her warmly, none suspecting that only hours before she had descended into a private underworld and severed the last tie to her childhood. Yet something subtle had shifted. She moved with an ease too refined, a tranquility too absolute, as if freed from a great burden. That calm unsettled those who watched her closely. The human face, they thought, should bear at least some trace of fatigue, grief, or struggle. But hers glowed with unearthly poise. Detective Daniel Mercer noticed it first. From the opposite side of the street he observed her that morning, his eyes narrowing against the light. She had not yet seen him, or perhaps she had, and merely pretended not to. The way she crossed the plaza, her heels striking stone with rhythm too perfect, made something twist in his gut. He carried her file tucked beneath his arm, a neat collection of missing persons reports, fragments of testimony, photographs blurred by time and poor lighting. Though each piece seemed innocuous on its own, when assembled they formed a pattern no one else dared admit. Too clean, he muttered to himself, far too clean. His superiors dismissed his suspicions, warning him not to harass an innocent woman of good standing. But Mercer's instincts, honed through years of tracking liars and predators, whispered otherwise, and he was not a man who ignored whispers. Inside the office, the air thickened with rumor. The receptionist claimed she had seen the secretary leaving after midnight, her silhouette slipping through rain with no umbrella. A clerk swore he caught her in the archive room alone, staring at the wall as if listening to some inaudible hymn. Even the managing director began to remark upon her uncanny efficiency, how no task seemed to fatigue her, how she appeared ageless, almost statuesque. They whispered when she passed, yet never to her face. Her smile disarmed them, her voice soothed them, her grace quelled suspicion, but beneath their admiration lay unease. Something about her presence disturbed the natural rhythm of the office, like a clock ticking slightly out of sync, noticed only when the room fell silent. That silence followed her home. At night she lay in bed, though sleep did not come easily. She felt Mercer's gaze in every darkened window, heard footsteps in alleys where no one walked. She checked the locks twice, thrice, until the sound of the bolts sliding into place resembled a ritual chant. Sometimes, as she descended into the basement to polish her tools, she thought she heard another breath behind her. Once she found the faintest smear of mud near the outer door, a footprint not her own. She scrubbed it until her hands ached, but the impression lingered in her mind long after the stain had vanished. Her boss, Mr. Ashcroft, grew bolder. He had long admired her composure, though admiration soured into possession. One evening he summoned her under the pretext of reviewing accounts. Alone in his office, the curtains drawn, his hand lingered too long upon hers as he passed a folder across the desk. "You are wasted here," he murmured, his eyes gleaming. "A woman of your talents deserves better opportunities." She withdrew her hand calmly, her gaze cool and unreadable. "Opportunities," she repeated, voice neutral. He smiled, leaning closer. "Loyalty is rewarded, discretion even more so." She left without answering, though the thought of him became another name she etched upon the hidden ledger in her mind, a ledger not of debts owed, but of balances to be corrected. Mercer, meanwhile, tightened his net. He requested old parish records, digging into the secretary's orphanage years, unearthing faded files of disciplinary reports, half-redacted notes from caretakers who described a child both gifted and unsettlingly composed. He examined employment ledgers from her earliest posts, noting each employer's fondness and the uncanny frequency with which former co-workers vanished into obscurity. Still, he lacked proof. Each piece could be dismissed as coincidence, each theory waved away as paranoia. But he knew the pattern, he felt it in his marrow, so he began to follow her openly. No more disguises, no more distant shadows. He lingered near her office door, trailed her down crowded streets, allowed her to see him watching. She responded not with panic, but with a faint smile, a silent acknowledgement of the game. One night, she returned home to find a folded note slipped beneath her door. No signature, only words scrawled in firm hand. Every mask cracks, every ledger leaves a trace. We will speak soon. She burned the paper in the sink, watching the flame consume it until nothing remained but ash. Her hands did not tremble, though her heart beat harder than it had in years. The city, too, seemed to turn against her. A newspaper headline announced another disappearance, a drifter found bloodless near the river. Rumors of a phantom spread in taverns and alleys, whispered by those who half believed in curses. She felt the myth forming around her, threads weaving into a story larger than herself. And once a myth takes root, it cannot be contained. Still, she moved through her days with impeccable calm. Her pen scratched across ledgers, her hands filed reports, her heels clicked in precise rhythm. Yet in her mind, she felt the circle tightening. Mercer behind her, Ashcroft circling above, whispers on every tongue. Her liberation had been purchased in blood, but freedom was never absolute. Chains may be broken, but new ones are always waiting. And sometimes, she thought, the hound at the door was not an enemy, but the inevitable echo of one's own footsteps. The Net Titans detective Daniel Mercer waited in the corridor, the hum of the office's electric lamps casting thin shadows along the paneled walls. Files pressed against his chest, heavy with the weight of names that no longer drew breath. Each page was a ghost, each name a question without answer. He had studied them until the ink blurred, until the same pale face appeared in every photograph, hers. He told himself this would end today. Inside her office, she worked with her customary precision, her pen gliding across the ledger as if nothing in the world existed beyond those lines of ink. Yet she felt him through the wall. His presence was as sharp and undeniable as the scent of ozone before a storm. She closed the book, folded her hands, and waited. The knock came, soft but deliberate. She rose and opened the door. Mercer stepped inside without invitation, his eyes hard, his jaw clenched. He placed the stack of files on her desk with a thud that reverberated through the wood. "You've left a trail," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it trembled a fever. "Not clean enough, never clean enough." She glanced at the files, then at him. Her smile was faint, almost kind. "You've been busy," she said, her tone without mockery, without fear. "I've been patient," he replied. He flipped the first folder open, revealing a blurred photograph of a man last seen leaving the city 2 winters ago. Beside it lay a faded police sketch, hastily drawn from a witness's uncertain memory. "Coincidence?" she murmured, glancing only briefly before returning her gaze to him. He snapped the folder shut. "Coincidence doesn't happen 23 times in the same city, doesn't vanish when you change employment, doesn't follow you like a shadow. No, this is a pattern, and patterns are truth." She moved to the window, drawing the blinds shut. The room dimmed, shadows stretching across her face. "And what truth have you found, detective?" she asked softly. "That evil wears a pleasant smile, that hunger can walk in heels and take dictation. You seek monsters in alleys and back streets, but they sit beside you in daylight, carrying coffee, filing papers." Her voice hardened. "Perhaps you fear me not because of what I've done, but because I prove your own blindness. How many vanished under your watch before you noticed?" Mercer's hand clenched into a fist. He wanted to strike the desk, to shout, to break the calm mask she wore. But her words slid beneath his skin, twisting, cutting. The silence stretched. Then she asked, almost gently, "Tell me, Daniel, do you want me caught, or do you want me understood?" The question struck him harder than accusation. For weeks he had felt the pull her composure, her beauty sharpened by mystery. He had told himself it was obsession born of duty, but alone with her in the dim room, he felt the truth like fire in his chest. He desired her ruin and her closeness in equal measure. A sudden knock at the outer door shattered the spell. "Mr. Ashcroft wants you," called the receptionist's voice through the partition. The The secretary smiled faintly, as if fate itself conspired to give her reprieve. She stepped past Mercer, her perfume lingering, and opened the door just wide enough to answer. "Tell Mr. Ashcroft I'll be there presently," she said, her tone smooth as silk. When she closed the door again, Mercer was already gathering his files. "This isn't over," he said. His eyes burned with conviction, yet also with something he dared not name. She watched him leave, her expression unreadable. That evening, she found another note beneath her door. "Different hand, different ink. You are not untouchable. Some debts are still unpaid. No signature, no explanation." She burned it as she had the last, but unease spread like frost through her veins. Who else was watching? Who else had pieced together fragments of her ledger? Mercer returned to his apartment that night with his mind ablaze. He poured whiskey into a chipped glass, stared at the files scattered across his table, and muttered to himself like a man possessed. "She's right there," he whispered, "right there, and they won't see it, won't believe it, won't touch her because she's perfect." He downed the glass, slammed it onto the wood, and resolved, if his superiors refused to act, he would. Proof or no proof, the following days wound tighter and tighter. Ashcroft pressed her with veiled advances, dangling promises of promotion. Mercer shadowed her steps like a hound, his eyes never leaving her figure. And the whispers in the office grew louder, not of admiration now, but of suspicion. She felt the shift. Her colleagues no longer praised her efficiency with warmth, but with nervous glances, their voices dropping when she entered the room. The mask was cracking. One night, as she left the building, Mercer stepped from the shadows and barred her path. "No more games," he said. Rain drummed against the pavement, his coat dripping, his hair plastered to his forehead. "You and I, we settled this now." Her lips curved into a smile, but her eyes gleamed like steel. "Very well," she whispered. "Follow, if you dare." She turned, walking into the night, her heels striking sharp against the stones. Mercer followed, each step binding him deeper into her labyrinth. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving only the glitter of lamplight across the wet stones. She led Mercer through the narrow lanes without haste, as though certain he would not falter. Her heels struck a metronome of inevitability, and still he followed, his coat heavy with rain, his eyes locked upon her silhouette. They reached the building, the office itself, looming as though it had awaited this very moment. She unlocked the door, pushed it wide, and gestured for him to enter. "Here," she said softly, "this is where it ends." The final descent. The corridors were empty, the night janitors long gone. Mercer's boots echoed on the polished floor, each step reverberating like a heartbeat. She guided him down the stairs to the basement, the air heavy with the smell of damp concrete and faint traces of bleach. "Why here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because this is where truth lives," she replied. She switched on the flickering fluorescent light. Shadows crawled across the walls, revealing the immaculate order she had preserved. Tools aligned with surgical precision, the floor scrubbed clean, the corners barren. Mercer's breath caught. He had imagined this room countless times, but to stand within it, to feel its stillness, was to step into the very marrow of her secret. "You see ghosts here," she said, reading his thoughts. "But there are no ghosts, only choices, my choices." The duel of voices. Mercer took a step forward, jaw clenched. "You killed them, all of them. You destroyed families, you carved men into shadows, and you left nothing but silence." She tilted her head, unshaken. "No, detective, I freed myself. Do you not see the difference? Survival requires transformation. I took back. It is balance." His hand trembled over the revolver hidden in his coat pocket. He wanted to draw it, to end her in this place of iron and stone, but his hand did not move. Something held him, not fear, not weakness, but the impossible weight of fascination. "You're not untouchable," he whispered. Her lips curved faintly. "Nor are you." The vanishing, what happened in that moment, Mercer would never clearly recount. The fluorescent light sputtered once, twice, then died, plunging the basement into darkness. He drew the revolver at last, his breath sharp in his throat. But when the light flickered back to life a moment later, the room was empty. The tools gleamed, the floor shone with its scrubbed polish, but she was gone. No door had opened, no sound of footsteps, yet the air still carried her perfume, faint as a memory. Mercer staggered, pressed his back against the wall, and searched every corner, every shadow, but he was alone. Aftermath: the following morning her desk sat empty, her chair tucked neatly beneath it, the surface scrubbed bare of fingerprints, the ledgers removed. In her apartment, the same, drawers empty, closets hollow, curtains drawn over immaculate silence. It was not departure, it was erasure. The police searched, notices were posted, colleagues whispered, some with relief, some with disbelief, but no trace remained. Only Mercer clung to the conviction that she had not fled, but ascended into another stage of her legend. Weeks later, across the sea, reports surfaced. A businessman vanished after meeting a striking woman in a hotel lounge. Descriptions varied: blonde, brunette, taller, shorter, but always the same elegance, the same aura that drew men like moths to flame. She had shed her skin again, and again, and again. The legend, the press took hold of the story, weaving her into something greater than flesh. They named her the Phantom Secretary, the Velvet Widow, the Silence in Silk. Articles blurred into myth, journals speculated on whether she existed at all. Some called her a vigilante, punishing greed and arrogance. Others a demon who wore the mask of charm to conceal the hunger of eternity. Mercer knew better. She was neither vigilante nor demon, but woman, a woman who had turned the wreckage of her childhood into a kingdom of shadows, and she was still out there. Welcome back, reader. You have followed her through childhood scars, orphanage walls, polished offices, and bloodied basements. You have seen her remake herself not once, but endlessly, until the line between fact and legend blurred into dust. Some say she perished long ago. Others swear they saw her in Paris, in Buenos Aires, in Singapore, always the same grace, always the same absence left behind. Perhaps she is dead, perhaps she thrives. The archives cannot confirm, but the records persist, and so must the telling.